Nate Black, who's back to talk about.
There's so much about PERS that we could go for years, actually, and that's what he's going to explain.
Well, this morning, for the next 30 minutes or so, what I was thinking we would do is talk about the history of CalPERS and let's get a real good understanding as to how we got here. And so I'm going to talk mostly about the state of California and what the state legislature did back in 1999. So a quick summary of what happened, then we'll get into various details of it, is that in 1999, nearly the entire legislature, both Senate and Assembly, voted to increase state pensions for state employees. And the most lucrative of those pensions went to police, CHP, fire, emergency personnel, that kind of thing. And as well, all of the regular general employees also received significant increases. The increases in Sutter County that came a few years later in 2004 were a 35% increase to the pensionable retirement stream. So that's the beginning, 1999. And the bill at the time was called SB 400. SB 400. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of that bill, and then we'll come back to what was going on at the moment that the bill came to be. And I think that your listeners will find some of this to be really interesting because, as we like to talk about, history is terribly important. We need to understand history so that we can analyze it and then look to how we got here and then use that to understand how do we get out should we be in a problem, which we are very significantly with this pension. So how big is the problem? The problem is, and this is about 1 year ago, I'm reading and I'm pulling some of this information from a September 18th, 2016 article written by Jack Dolan from LA Times, and his article is titled The Pension Gap. It's a very, very good article. This really lays out thoughtfully how we got here and all of the things that I'm about to speak to. So the crux of the justification, that is, how did the proponents of these pension increases, the lawmakers themselves as well as, for example, union bosses, how did they describe and justify this enormous increase to retirements for our state employees? They did it by saying as follows, that the pension fund, would grow fast enough to pay the bill in full. So yes, we're going to increase, say, 35%. In fact, the increase is even greater when you consider that they reduce the age requirement for retirement. So, for example, a CHP officer would retire at age 50. So at age 50, having been in the CHP, for example, California Highway Patrol for, say, 30 years since the age of 20, they're going to take that 30 years of service times 3% to cap out at 90% of their salary. So 30 years times 3%, 90%. That 90% times their highest salary, which is generally their last year's salary, that's what they get to collect until they pass away, so for the rest of their life. And again, at age 50, you can expect perhaps a 30 to 40 year retirement life or life until you, say, get to 90 years old. Well, that means that your retirement span is actually even greater than the 30 years that you put in the service. So that alone, that issue right there, you should step back and go, ooh, does that work? Our age expectancy, our life expectancy tables, they're getting so high. Is it really a situation where we can afford a retirement that is going to be even longer than the service life of the employee that generated that retirement? So that's kind of an interesting issue, and that's something that as we establish pension rates, again, that 3% rate, or myself as auditor controller of Sutter County, I'm what's called post-PEPRA, and I have a 2% rate on my pension. So it's 2% times my years of service, just as an example, and that's a good thing. 2% is a much more sustainable rate to pay folks as retirement. So in the ensuing 16, 17 years, from about 1999 to 2016, which is the year which these figures derive from, the cost of the employee pensions on an annual basis in 2016 was about $5.4 billion. That is 30 times greater than the same figure, what the pension cost was in 1999. So in 1999, and then you grow 17 years forward, we went up 30%, 30 times. That's a multiple of 30 that you affix to the amount that we were paying back then. So 30, that growth is just astronomical. And it's leading to all of these budget concerns at local jurisdictions and state jurisdiction, the state, to be able to afford these increases. And the increases are going up, not down. And they're going up terribly severely as the investment assumptions are also coming down. That is, the rate of return on those assumptions, such as we talked about in prior weeks, that decrease, it's all compounding and making this a much greater problem than I think they anticipated. Now, I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what the proponents were saying at the time in 1999. What were they saying to the lawmakers, for example? How were they justifying this? And I've already described it in general, but I want to talk now more specifically. So let's pull out one example. And I'm going to also describe a couple of folks that were very cautionary, and as well, they were advocating not the passage of these very lucrative increases to pensions. So, as you probably would expect, some of the biggest proponents were union bosses. And so I wanted to describe one right out of the gates that I thought was just so interesting. So this gentleman, his name is Joe Ham. He's the former head of the California Association of Highway Patrolmen. So the association, which is not the union, I do not believe. That's I'm unknown on that at this moment, but I'll just say, John Ham says the follow. He says, if I was in the private sector, just struggling to get by, had no dream of retiring, would I be upset? Yeah. And we would have to understand that's a reality. And what he's talking about is pension envy. He's saying that the folks in the private sector are envious of the high pension in the public sector. And then he follows that he says that he believes that the sweetened pensions are not sustainable. Quote, there's no way to close this gap without some sort of hit or financial pain for those employees. So that's him acknowledging that the pension rate of 3% at, say, age 50 for the folks that he used to represent in law enforcement is an unsustainable rate. And now I will caveat to say that the 90% figure I referred to earlier for law enforcement, that is their max. You can't get above 90% in California law enforcement land for purposes of pension. They are capped at 90%. That is not applied.
That is still an astronomical figure.
That is a big figure, yes. But that is not the case for general employees. So employees of the county that are not in law enforcement, let's say they worked for 40 years, and that does occur. For them, for example, in Sutter County, it would be 40 years times 2.7%, which 40 times 2 is 80, and then the 0.7 of the 40 is going to get you another about 30. So you're talking 110% salary for their retirement. So they're actually getting a higher retirement payment the day after they retire than they were receiving in terms of their salary, again, that day before. So, and then also if you add to that they're, say, age 55 for general employees, and they're going to have another 30 to 35 years of average lifespan, that payment stream is enormous. And there's a figure in this article that I thought was great, and it says that, go back to the law enforcement figure of, say, the 90% of their salary, that if you were to set aside an amount of money and use that to pay for this 90% of that average salary, that CHP salary, what that would produce, again, I'm talking average here, and assuming that the average officer retires at the age of 54, a few years after their 50-year birthday, which they become eligible to retire. At any rate, the annuity that you would have to set aside to afford that kind of payment stream is about $2.6 million. So one employee, you need to set aside $2.6 million today to be able to fund their full retirement for the next, again, say 30 years, 35 years before they pass. So that's one employee. Now multiply that times all of the employees, and you can see how this is a really big figure. So back to, let's talk about a lawmaker who I really want to highlight here. His name is William Christ. And actually, I apologize. He was not a lawmaker. He was the economics professor at CSU Stanislaus, as well as the chairman of the CalPERS board when it pushed for this bigger state pension increase. And so he dismisses good professional caution coming from what I consider to be the experts. He says, and this is, again, a way for him to dismiss the CalPERS actuary, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. He says, I quote, and again, this is William Christ, "I guess the best case for the retirement system is everybody dies tonight," end quote. I'm going to continue. "We could go through a modeling exercise where we make all sorts of different assumptions and make predictions, but that's really more than I think we can expect our staff to do." Okay, so he says we can go through and make all sorts of assumptions and predictions, but that's really more than I think we can expect our staff to do. Well, let me say this. That's terrifying, that man, as chairman of the CalPERS board, would say that making all sorts of different assumptions and predictions is more than he expects his staff to do. Well, we're now in a situation where that state pension that he's referring to and that he increased with his fellow board members, that pension amount now represents $241 billion unfunded pension liability across the state. $241 billion, and this is as of last year. So for him to dismiss the actuary and then to kind of make light of it and say, hey, we can't expect our staff to, do their job and make analysis and bring us various scenarios, which is what the actuary did, because that would be too much work. Well, instead, let's just go ahead and ram this through, and we'll let, as I keep harping on, our children and grandchildren pay for it and deal with it. That's not exactly a very adult thing to do. And that decision and the way in which he conducted himself is causing so much pain for decades to come. Thank you, Mr. Christ.
Didn't that affect his own pension?
Yeah. I mean...
isn't that a conflict of interest? Isn't that a...
I was thinking the same thing this morning, Andy.
Should he be jailed?
I was thinking that we really should reconsider our lawmakers in this country, from Congress to state to local, and say, is it appropriate that we provide them with retirements? Can we go back to something, for example, that's a little bit more American, where you are a citizen politician for a very short period of time, say a 4 or 8 year period, and then you go back to the farm or back to your business and you keep being productive. But you don't make a career out of it for 40 years, such as Harry Reid did next door in Nevada. Okay, a couple more things.
But on
please.
that point, even so, if they decided to become a career politician and they were going to stay in that for their whole lives, we shouldn't be giving them a pension anyways, because their salaries are large enough that they should be able to budget for that. Should they not? Maybe their extravagant lives and vacations could be tapered down a little bit, and they could put in their paychecks with a 401k or something like that.
Well, I think that they obviously, in their position, have opportunities that nobody else in our country receive. And what I mean by that is they form relationships, lifelong in some cases, with lobbyists and various others who take care of them. And there's very much a back-scratching situation.
Don't you go to jail for insider trading unless you're a politician, and then it's legal.
Well, speaking of that, Andy, and I'm not going to say that he went to jail, but Mr. Christ, William Christ, again, CalPERS chairman at the time that they passed this enormous increase in 1999, I think that you'll find it interesting that in 2010, his name surfaced in a pay-to-play scandal that rocked CalPERS after retiring in 2003. Mr. Christ accepted more than $800,000 from a British financial firm to help secure hundreds of millions in investments from the pension fund. And Christ was not accused of wrongdoing. I'm just describing that he did receive nearly $1 million from a financial firm, which, being that position that he was in, definitely causes questions.
Right.
So,
Get close to the mic.
little bit more about assumptions and kind of what happened back then. I just want to let you know that the actuary at CalPERS did, I think, a fairly good job. His name is Sealing, Ron Sealing, I believe. He did a fairly good job in going before the board and giving them a moment, what should have led them to pause and say, oh, maybe we need to analyze this further. And so what he did is he put together three different scenarios. One scenario was a very rosy scenario. The second was we hit it just as we expect, and the expectation at that time was 8.25% yield per year, which again we've come down to 7.5 now, 7.375, going to 7% in a couple more years. And so, and then the third analysis, or the third scenario he ran, was that half of that yield is received. So instead of 8.25, something like 4.125 is received per year. And his quote, the quotation he has under that third scenario, which is also, by the way, what ended up happening in terms of an average yield. It's much closer to his worst case scenario than it was either of the other two scenarios. And he said it would be, quote, fairly catastrophic. And Mr. Sealing was proved correct. And I want to say that our local elected official at the time, Robert Stark in Sutter County, my predecessor, he was also correct, by the way. In 2004, when this was done in Sutter County, he went before the board and cautioned them against doing this, saying that it was not sustainable, that the expected returns were not there. Let's talk a little bit about where he came up with that. So in 1999, the ensuing 3 years after they passed this bill were terrible returns, by the way, at the Dow Jones. So the three return years, I have them right here, okay, were 6% drop. So not 6% yield, but a negative 6%. The second year, negative 7%. And then the third year, so this would be like 2003 or so, 17%. So 6, 7, and 17% drops in 3 years. Each of the 3 years following this major pension increase. So all of the extra cash, quote, or investment money that they had in 1999, which they were a little bit super funded, that all evaporated in just a couple, 3 years after their decision. And how you see that is, you can see if you go to this article, again, LA Times, the article title is The Pension Gap. You'll see that on about 3 pages or so into it, if you printed it, there's a gap in pension funding analysis, and it shows their expected returns and how that would increase the contributions that would be required from the state agencies. They were about $18 billion off as of the 2010-2011 fiscal year. So that is, we had to contribute, the state, about $25 billion total over the past, this is about 12-year period, as opposed to the $6.6 billion they expected. So they expect in 1999, over the next 10 years, you're only going to need to pay $6.6 billion. It ended up being 25. So the expectations were way too rosy at the time, and it's really bitten us. I want to say one more thing about the legislative process and how this came to be. So the senator who authored and carried the bill She did this in 1999 in about September 10th, 1999. Her name was Senator Deborah Ortiz. In less than 45 seconds on the Senate floor, her colleagues had already seconded her motion and moved SB 400 through. So in 45 seconds, she starts to describe how, and the reason she was the Sacramento district, by the way, senator, and that has the largest number of state employees. So that's why she authored and carried the bill. So she starts to say how the security staff literally present in this room, the sergeant at arms, blah, 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 those folks are going to benefit from this. Well, those folks protect with guns our lawmakers. And so it just was so easy for the lawmakers to rubber stamp this and to move it through. So I want to say that 45-second introduction to this bill was probably insufficient to fully analyze. I know I'm being a little sarcastic here, but to fully analyze what's going on. Yeah. And what I did is I printed out a quotation from one of my favorite framers to the Constitution and founders who wrote the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson says this, I quote, "The instability of our laws is really an immense evil. I think it would be well to provide in our constitutions that there shall be always a 12-month period between the engrossing of a bill and the passing of it. That is, it should then be offered to its passage without changing a word, and that if circumstances should be brought to require a speedier passage, it should take 2/3 of both houses instead of a bare majority," end quote. So what he's saying there is, for most bills, and I would say non-security or non-national security in general, those kinds of things that are most bills in our country, that they should be authored and then they should be set aside for a year. And they cannot change a single word of it, so that everybody, every American, every lawmaker, every individual in the media has the all the time in the world to look at and analyze this before a single vote can be taken. And I say that to say that maybe we need to reconsider how we're creating laws in this country, because we have perhaps too many. And if they're making them, so when Nancy Pelosi says, we need to pass the bill, and I'm referring to the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, we need to pass it so that we can figure out what's in it. That she would say those words it's just scary.
It's against what America stands for. The transparency, the people being involved in the process of controlling the country.
Yeah, it breaks down the constitutional republic. When we're creating laws that we don't even understand. And I want to take a moment to quickly state that Mr. Starkey, Chris Starkey in Sutter County, he is uploading this to YouTube at One Eye Blind Media. So if you go to YouTube, One Eye Blind Media, you can locate Dollars and Cents, which is the title of the segment. So I just wanted to let you know that if you don't catch this, or if you want to refer to a friend to what we've talked about, please seek that out. It's really well produced, and I appreciate it very much.
I'm going to send a link for this show to the RCRC and SACOG to see if we can actually take our head out of the sand and face reality. The problem we have is too many people kick the can down the road, and that's a worn out expression, but it appropriately describes shirking your responsibility as a responsible person.
Right. A couple of, just to carry this home. Who signed this bill back in 1999? It was Gray Davis, Governor Gray Davis. 17 years since that signing, he says as follows, quote, "If you're asking me, with everything I've learned in the last 17 years, would I have signed SB 400? No, I would not have signed it."
Wow. That's, and hindsight's 2015. But actually researching the bill properly is what should have been done. And people need to hold their politicians accountable. Anyhow. Okay.
So
Matt
we
wants
have about 2 minutes left, but I just really quickly wanted to address. We had a caller just now while you were speaking. I think his name was George, if I'm not wrong. And he brought up the point that when Orange County went through bankruptcy, they switched from CalPERS to private pension plans, and that it's greatly improved the situation. Address that topic if you can.
Well, tell you what, to the caller, one, I really appreciate the effort and calling in this morning, and let me review that and research it and better understand how Orange County went through that bankruptcy and what specifics enabled them to create their own retirement system. And then, if you wouldn't mind, I can speak to that a little bit better in a future program.
Great.
But we have to pass it to know what's in it. Wait a minute.
Right. And Matt, you've asked me before, what's the thing that we can do? How do we solve these enormous problems? And I'll say that we have got to organize. I'm an accountant. I know finance and accounting. Okay, that's my expertise, but I don't know how to organize. We need to organize and move on creating positive change and being really thoughtful and deliberate and taking the time, such as Thomas Jefferson is advising us from the grave. Don't rush through laws. Laws apply to every American under the sun. You don't want to rush through it and get it wrong.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Get involved.
And as always, excellent and interesting conversation. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
This is